For this, what's going on in the world, it's impossible as, a rabbi to want to try to talk about the Torah portion, and you can't possibly ignore just the unfolding terror that we are all, I think we're all in a state of PTSD as Jewish people right now. And that really was driven home to me in something that there was a meeting with the Israeli consulate last week at Temple Sinai to be followed by a rabbinic processing session. I'd never actually been to a processing session before, but just to kind of let out what we're feeling at this difficult time. I had no intention of staying for the processing session because I thought in my mind, I don't need to process. I'm angry, I'm upset, I don't need to process. I'm glad I stayed for it. I ended up staying just because I had a couple of friends that were there, and so we were sitting schmoozing and ate lunch. And rabbis are unfolding, and sharing little by little, and some of them really, you could see just the inner turmoil. One of my colleagues shared, all the values that I thought were shared, that we had such allies in the community for all the people that we stood up for, would stand up when we're going through this, and not there. And it makes you question all of the values that you have. So everybody's got their own particular way that they're trying to make sense of not just the horrific events, and I think the horrific events, though they're bad enough, is the fact of the way the world is responding to them. The Jewish community that has made it an absolute priority to be there passionately defending every cause out there when anybody else is targeted or feeling unvalued in any way, to lift everybody up. And now when Israel is responding as it has no choice to do, in response to these atrocities, recognizing that if they don't respond, this is going to continue over and over again. Hamas says so. That's their plan, to do October 7th again and again and again. We recognize that Israel's got to do whatever it can to survive and to defend itself. And so that's what Israel's doing. But when you hear the responses demanding a ceasefire or just ignoring what took place, or just not ignoring it so much as just de-emphasizing it and emphasizing the civilian toll in Gaza, which I get it. And I'm not happy with the civilian toll in Gaza. But the answer that I keep yelling at the TV is release the hostages. You want a ceasefire? Release the hostages. You want a humanitarian pause? Release the hostages. It's so obvious. But the world somehow, I guess, just puts pressure on Israel because at least you have somebody to talk to. It's not like Hamas is giving TV interviews. So anyway, when I look at this week's Torah portion, and rabbis, by the way, like to pride ourselves that we could take any verse in the Bible and connect it to anything I want to talk about, right? So if I want to talk about sewage tanks, I can find a pasuk in the Torah and say, that is talking about sewage systems. So the one passage that comes to my mind in this week's Torah portion is it came to pass when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim. And I think to myself, today we are seeing a different kind of eyes being dim. People that don't see, can barely see, or people who refuse to see. There are many people that are just blind to the truth, or they're blinded by hate. I mean, when you chant from the river to the sea, free Palestine, you're basically saying, not only are we going to eradicate all the Jews, but they're all going to face the atrocities that those hundreds, a little over 1,000 faced. So even when people are proven wrong about ridiculous claims that are made in the media, they refuse to open up their eyes to the truth. For instance, remember how many news stories there were about Israel bombing a hospital and killing 500 civilians, half of which were purported to be children? Well, now we know that this story is a total fabrication. Not only were not 500 killed, not only not 250 were killed, but the hospital in question actually was not bombed at all. It was a rocket that hit the parking lot. And not only that, it wasn't our rocket. It was a Hamas rocket that was intended to kill civilians that misfired and fell into the parking lot. And immediately, the world just goes with that. Hamas, that's the thing that drives me most crazy when I watch the media today. All of the claims that are made by Hamas or sympathizers are not really questioned. They're just stated. And everything that Israel shows, well, how do you really know that's a tunnel shaft? Maybe it's a part of the building of the original plan of the hospital. I mean, how do you know? So it's just this dystopian reality that we're all living in right now. So to this day, there's still this multitude of, I cannot describe it any other way, but just Jew-hating people out there who continue to bring up how Israel bombed the hospital. And another example was the BBC had to issue several apologies. And you know I have a sense of humor by nature. I like to find the funny in things. I don't know how Israel's doing it, but it is amazing. There's a TV show in Israel called Eretz Nehederet. It's sort of like the the Israeli version of Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. And they have had a whole series, and everybody can watch them. You don't need to speak Hebrew because they're done in English. Parodies of the BBC News. And everyone is more funny and heartbreaking than the next. I mean, it's really, I think a Jewish response to heartbreak is to try to find the laughter and the lunacy in all of it. I think Elie Wiesel actually once said the way he and so many people survived the atrocities of the Shoah is that we have this ridiculous sense of humor, and we're sort of consoled in a weird way by the absurdity of what we see going on around us. And sometimes the response to that kind of terror has to be nothing other than laughter at how they could do it. So, for example, BBC, amongst the many apologies they issued, when they claimed that Israel attacked the medical staff at Shifa Hospital in Gaza. And they had to retract it and say, well, it's just a little mistranslation. Israel sent medical staff to Shifa Hospital in Gaza. So that gets mentioned, in passing. We just issue that little apology. But meanwhile, the damage is done. And the media is, going to just continue to flood us with that narrative of big bad Israel that just won't do the humane thing and have a ceasefire. To which the answer only has to be, over and over again, release the hostages. You want a humanitarian pause, tell Hamas to release the hostages. That ought to be the knee-jerk response in the media. I don't get how it isn't. But it's not an issue. I mean, Jews are just supposed to accept these atrocities and move on. Why can't the Jews just move on? And I have to tell you, I was supposed to stay at Temple Sinai. They were going to air after this meeting at 11 a.m. They were going to air the IDF edited video. I've seen enough of it that I couldn't do it. I just couldn't stay there. So I do think it's great that the world sees it, because when we see it, we see our relatives. When the rest of the world sees it, they see atrocities. Maybe they can watch it better that way. But at least maybe then they can begin to understand why Israel is doing what it's doing. You can't live with that on your border. How many people are not going to be able to return to their homes living in the Gaza envelope because they're not going to feel safe in doing so? And in essence, you end up seizing, giving up territory in that way in already a very, very tiny country. And you look, when you zoom out of that region, Israel's this tiny little dot in this big sea of the Arab world, and they just won't leave us alone. So in this week's Parsha, Isaac asks his son, "Who are you?" And I think that's the question that every human being needs to ask themselves right now. Who are we? Do we have civility? Are we going to respond to what we see going on? And instead of just asking, who are you, the question for us is, who are we? Well, I think many of the Jewish people answered that question last Tuesday when I and so many of us, almost 300,000 Jews, were on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It was a wildly successful march for one reason in my mind. We've been feeling so isolated, so vulnerable, so dejected, so depressed, and just so traumatized. It was this just explosion of the Jewish people coming together, being surrounded by people who get it, seeing the Israeli spirit again, beautiful music by Ishai Ribo, and the speakers and the dancing of all those young college kids up there, and saying, the real answer to tragedy in Jewish mind, in Israeli parlance, lo nafsik lashir. We're not going to stop singing, despite what they try to do to us. And so this, it was incredibly encouraging just being there. And I know, a few of you here in the congregation were there. I think we had about 20, 25 people from the shul that were there, about 800 from Atlanta. If you didn't go, and some people expressed to me they weren't going because they were worried about safety, there was nothing to worry about. We're surrounded by 300,000 Jews, not to mention the security. And already you're seeing on social media all the comparisons between Israel rally, which is completely peaceful, hundreds of thousands of people, nothing going on. The only thing I saw that came close to violence, and it wasn't violence, was you had the crazy Hasidim of Neturei Karta. These are the Hasidim that believe the Mashiach has to come before there should be Israel, and we should all be governed by the Palestinians until the Messiah comes. And of course, Jews for suicide. So Neturei Karta are sitting out there, and there was another group of Hasidim that came up to the fence where they were, because they were on the other side of this protected area, yelling at them in Yiddish. And it was just awesome. My Yiddish is okay, but it was enough to understand, Michigan, give him a klop over and cup, give this guy a hit in the head, what a Michigan, what's going on here? So it was very powerful to see the unity of the Jewish people, from Israelis to Americans to Haredim to members of Christians United for Israel that were there, young and old, all coming together in this powerful, really history-making supportive event. So, we Jews are not a fatalistic people. Hamas, unfortunately, is fatalistic. As they proudly say, the Jews love life, we glorify death. They say it. And they welcome death and they welcome martyrdom. I mean, to see things projected on the campus of George Washington University, glory to our martyrs. This is ISIS supporters. It's really no different. And so this country needs an awakening to say, hey, this is so beyond the pale. Anybody that supports that cannot be given any sort of quarter or given the right to say that. You can imagine what the Jewish people would be doing right now if we had a small band of even one person, right? Like when Baruch Goldstein shot up the mosque in Hebron, and the whole Jewish world, I mean, at least 99.9% of them, rose up in horror condemning it. Why am I not hearing that from my imams in Atlanta? Why am I not hearing that kind of support that we should be hearing at this point? And that's the thing that really hurts. And that was best answered by this meme that said, the Jewish people, unfortunately, in the last few weeks have learned that the world doesn't care as much about us as we have hoped, but we learned that we care about each other much more than we realized. And that was the power of that moment. So the truth is that the media ought to be saying, and we all ought to be reminding the world of, is you don't get to murder Jewish babies. Nobody gets to rape Jewish women. When you talk about proportionality, does that mean, as Douglas Murray, I think, said, that we should rape precisely the amount of women in the Palestinians that they raped us? We should kill the same amount of babies. We should behead the same amount of children that they beheaded. It's crazy. Proportionality is the most ridiculous statement that you can imagine. The fact is, Israel does not conduct itself that way and never would. Thank God. It's not in our ethos. But where's the ethos of others standing with us at this time? And that is the thing that I know is eating at all of our neshamas during this difficult time. So at the end of the day, I just leave you with the thought, we're not going to give up as a Jewish people. We've endured this kind of barbarity before and have managed to come through. And, I believe we'll come through it this time as well. But all of us have a part to play, as I've said many times. Keep making those calls to members of Congress. Keep showing up. Donating is important, absolutely, but just the message has to keep being said. Because if we don't do it, what we're learning, sadly, is nobody's going to do it for us.